The air inside the grand high-ceilinged classroom at Westbridge Academy was thick with the quiet hum of student chatter and the occasional scratch of pencils against paper. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting diagonal beams across the polished wooden floors. The walls, lined with bookshelves and framed mathematical theories, whispered of intellectual rigor. Michael Brooks sat at his usual seat near the window, his posture relaxed, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against his notebook. His dark eyes followed the slow sway of leaves outside, his mind drifting beyond the classroom's walls. He wasn't inattentive, far from it. Numbers danced in his head, complex equations forming and dissolving like patterns in water. But the structured monotony of the class, the endless drilling of concepts he had mastered years ago, left him unengaged. At the front of the room, Mr. Devlin, a stern-faced man in a crisp navy suit, surveyed his students with the cool gaze of someone who had long since lost faith in their potential. He thrived on control, on ensuring that no student slipped through his grasp. And right now, Michael was slipping. "Brooks." Devlin's voice snapped through the air like a whip, silencing the low murmur of students. Michael blinked, his head turning slightly. "Yes, sir." His voice was even, though a flicker of unease stirred in his stomach. "You seem deeply engrossed in something outside that window. Perhaps you'd like to share your insights with the rest of the class?" Devlin's tone was laced with condescension, his sharp eyes narrowing. A few quiet chuckles echoed through the room. Michael exhaled through his nose. "No, sir," he said simply. Devlin smirked. "Then let's see if you've been paying attention." He turned to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and began writing, his movements precise, deliberate. What appeared was a monstrous equation, a tangled labyrinth of variables and exponents, a problem far beyond the class's current level. The room tensed. A few students exchanged wary glances, while others leaned forward in curiosity. "Come up here," Devlin commanded, stepping aside. "Solve it." A murmur spread through the classroom. This wasn't a test. It was an ambush. Michael hesitated, the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. He could feel the smirks of those who had always dismissed him, the expectant grins of those who relished the idea of watching him fail. His fingers curled into a fist beneath his desk. Then slowly he rose. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound stark against the hush that had fallen over the room. Each step toward the board felt measured, deliberate. When he reached the front, he took the marker from Devlin's outstretched hand. The problem loomed before him. But where others saw an impassable wall, Michael saw the scaffolding behind it, the foundation, the symmetry hidden beneath the chaos. He inhaled, and then he began. At first, there was only the soft squeak of a marker gliding across the board. His movements were careful, almost hesitant. But then something shifted. His hand moved faster, more fluidly, breaking the problem down into elegant, precise steps. The impossible equation unraveled before their eyes. The class watched in stunned silence. Someone whispered, "No way." Even Devlin's smug expression had vanished, replaced with something unreadable. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears, but his hand remained steady. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing this because this was where his mind found clarity. The numbers weren't a challenge. They were a language, a rhythm he had always known. Final stroke. The answer stood complete. The classroom felt frozen in time. Then a voice, flat, controlled, but edged with something reluctant. "That is correct," Devlin admitted. For the first time, Michael turned to face them. And the room saw him differently. The air in the classroom was thick with unspoken tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Michael stood there, marker still in hand, his heart pounding beneath the surface of his calm exterior. He could feel the weight of their stares, some wide-eyed, some skeptical, some quietly impressed. A few students exchanged hushed whispers. No way he actually solved that. Did he cheat? That was unreal. Michael let the murmurs pass over him. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Mockery, disbelief, maybe even Devlin shrugging it off as luck. But what he hadn't expected was the silence. It wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of realization. Devlin took a slow step forward, his fingers adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "Take your seat, Brooks," he said, his voice measured, lacking its usual sharpness. Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing the marker down and making his way back to his desk. As he sat, he could feel eyes still lingering on him. The usual feeling of invisibility, something he had relied on, something he had built his world around, was slipping away, and he didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. Lunch period. Michael barely had time to pull out his notebook before a shadow loomed over his table. Emily Raymond. She was one of the smartest students in class, sharp-witted, confident, nothing like him. She always had the answer before anyone else, always the one to correct others without hesitation. But right now, she was just staring at him, arms crossed, a thoughtful frown on her face. "You've been holding out on us, Brooks," she said. Michael looked up from his untouched lunch. "I don't know what you're talking about." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, come on. You sit there every day, quiet as a ghost, acting like this class is beneath you. But then the second Devlin puts you on the spot, you pull off whatever that was." She tapped a finger on the table. "So, what's the deal? Secret genius, or did you sell your soul for math powers?" Michael smirked despite himself. "Neither." "Right. Because normal people solve impossible equations like it's just another Tuesday." He exhaled. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. And yet, for some reason, he found himself saying, "I like numbers. They make sense to me." More sense than— He gestured vaguely at the cafeteria full of talking, laughing students. "This." Emily studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Figures. Well, you just made life a lot more interesting. People are talking about you. You know." Michael stiffened. "I don't want that. Tough luck. You just became the most interesting thing to happen in Devlin's class since Marcus Turner fell asleep during a test and snored so loud he scared himself awake." Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. He had spent years keeping his head down, blending into the background. He liked the quiet. But now the quiet was gone, and in its place, attention. End of the day. Michael had almost made it out of the building unnoticed when a voice stopped him. "Brooks." "A word." "Devlin." Michael turned slowly, watching as his teacher stood near the entrance of the classroom, arms crossed. Most of the other students had already left. He swallowed and stepped forward. Devlin studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes scanning him as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You've been hiding," he finally said. Michael didn't respond. Devlin continued. "That problem I put on the board, that wasn't a test for you. That was meant to make a point." His voice was laced with something Michael couldn't quite place. Not irritation, not disappointment. Something else. "You were supposed to struggle. But instead, you made a mockery of the challenge." Michael's jaw tightened. "I wasn't trying to prove anything." "Then why did you?" The question lingered between them, heavy with implication. Devlin exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Regardless, you have talent. And talent is wasted if it's not pushed to its limits." Michael's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone." "Perhaps not," Devlin mused. "But I have a proposition for you." Michael frowned. "What kind of proposition?" Devlin's lips curved into something almost resembling a smirk. "The district math competition is in 3 weeks. You'll be competing." Michael blinked. "What?" "You heard me." A cold weight settled in his stomach. "I never signed up for that. And yet, your name will be on the roster by tomorrow morning." Michael stared at him. "You can't just—" "Oh, I can." Devlin's eyes gleamed. "And I just did." Michael felt his pulse quicken, a mix of anger and unease twisting inside him. "Why?" Devlin's smirk faded, and for a moment, he looked at Michael with something almost like conviction. "Because students like you don't come around often. And because I want to see what happens when you stop hiding." Michael clenched his jaw. For years, he had built a wall around himself. But now, piece by piece, it was being dismantled. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to stop it. The night air in Los Angeles carried the crispness of early autumn, a welcome contrast to the lingering heat of the day. Michael sat on the edge of his bed, a mechanical pencil twirling between his fingers, his thoughts tangled in the events of the afternoon. His name would be on the roster for the district math competition. Not by choice. Not because he wanted to stand out, but because Devlin had decided for him. The injustice of it gnawed at him. His mother, a woman whose kindness often masked her exhaustion from working long shifts at the hospital, peeked into his room. "You're unusually quiet tonight," she observed. Michael hesitated. His mother was the only person he could talk to, but he didn't know how to voice what he was feeling. Devlin is making me compete in a math competition. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. And this is a bad thing. Michael exhaled through his nose. I didn't ask for this. I don't want the attention. She studied him for a moment before stepping forward and sitting beside him. Sweetheart, I know you like to stay under the radar. But maybe this isn't about attention. Maybe it's about proving something to yourself. He didn't respond. Because the truth was, he wasn't sure if he wanted to prove anything at all. The next morning, Westbridge Academy buzzed with the usual energy of students moving between classes, but something was different. Michael felt it the second he walked through the hallway, the glances. Some curious, some amused, some skeptical. Whispers followed him like a quiet ripple in water. That's the kid from Devlin's class. The math freak. No way he actually solved that problem. He must have memorized it. Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to walk as if he didn't hear them. He had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible. Now, it felt like a spotlight had been thrown on him, and he had no idea how to step out of its glare. As he rounded the corner to his locker, he found Emily Raymond leaning against it, arms crossed, watching him with an amused expression. Well, look who's famous, she teased. Michael sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Please tell me this will blow over. She smirked. Oh, not a chance. Devlin put your name on the competition board. People actually care now. Michael groaned. Fantastic. Look, Brooks, I get it. You don't want people in your business. But you did something incredible, and now people see you differently. It's not the worst thing in the world. He shoved his books into his locker with more force than necessary. It is when you just want to be left alone. Emily studied him for a long moment before shrugging. All right, then. Hide if you want. But let me ask you something. Why does it scare you so much? Michael stiffened. It wasn't fear, was it? Before he could answer, the warning bell rang, and Emily pushed off the lockers with a knowing smile. Think about it, genius. By the time math class rolled around, Michael had resigned himself to his fate. The competition board at the front of the room displayed a list of students from different schools, each name meticulously typed except for one, hastily scribbled in Devlin's sharp handwriting. Michael Brooks, Westbridge Academy. He stared at it, his stomach twisting. Take your seats, Devlin's voice rang out as he strode into the classroom. His gaze flickered to Michael, but held no trace of amusement this time. As the lesson dragged on, Michael tried to focus, but his mind wandered. The competition wasn't just about solving equations. It was about stepping into something he had spent his life avoiding. The realization unsettled him. And then Devlin spoke again. There's no backing out, Brooks. I expect you to be ready. Michael met his gaze. He could see the challenge in the teacher's eyes. For the first time, he wondered, was Devlin pushing him because he saw something more in him? Or was he setting him up to fail? Michael didn't know the answer. But one thing was certain, he would find out. The days leading up to the district math competition passed in a blur, each one thick with the weight of expectations Michael never asked for. He could feel it everywhere, in the way students whispered his name in the hallways, in the way Devlin's sharp gaze followed him in class, in the way his mother's eyes gleamed with quiet hope whenever she asked about his progress. Even Emily had stopped teasing and started watching him with something closer to curiosity. But inside, Michael felt like he was walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss. He had spent years building a world where he could exist without notice, where his talent was his own secret. Now that world was collapsing, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay beyond it. Westbridge Academy Library, late evening. Michael sat at his usual table, a dim pool of lamplight illuminating the scattered pages in front of him. Equations, theorems, calculations, they had always been his escape. But tonight the numbers blurred together. His mind wasn't failing him. His focus was. The quiet creak of a chair being pulled out across from him made him look up. Emily. She rested her elbows on the table, watching him with her usual mix of amusement and scrutiny. You look like you're trying to escape through that textbook. Michael sighed, closing the book. Just thinking. About the competition. He hesitated before nodding. Emily leaned back, tapping a pen against the table. You know, for someone who literally destroyed a college-level problem in front of the whole class, You don't seem too excited about proving yourself again. Michael exhaled slowly. Because I don't want to prove anything. Then why are you doing it? Because Devlin gave me no choice. Emily raised an eyebrow. And you're just going along with it? Michael didn't respond. She studied him for a moment before tilting her head. You're scared. A muscle in Michael's jaw tensed. I'm not scared. Emily smirked. Right. Because avoiding something at all costs definitely doesn't mean you're scared of it. Michael shot her a look. She leaned forward. Look, Brooks. I get it. If you put yourself out there, people will expect more. They'll start paying attention. But why does that bother you so much? Michael's fingers curled around the edge of his notebook. He thought about all the times he had been the quiet kid, the one who never had to meet anyone's expectations because no one thought to have any for him. The one who was just smart enough to coast, but not loud enough to be noticed. And he thought about what would happen if that changed. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he messed up? What if the moment he stepped into the light, he realized he didn't belong there? Emily seemed to sense the storm in his head. Her voice was softer when she spoke again. You already proved them wrong once, she said. You can either keep running from it or own it. Michael stared at her. The words lodged themselves deep inside him, like an equation waiting to be solved. And for the first time, he didn't know the answer. The night before the competition, Michael sat at the kitchen table, a pencil hovering over his notebook. His mother sat across from him, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, her expression warm but unreadable. You haven't said much about tomorrow, she said gently. Michael kept his eyes on the blank page. Not much to say. She smiled faintly, except that it's the first time you're stepping into something like this, and you're not sure if you want to. He looked up at her. His mother had always been able to see right through him. She reached out, placing a hand over his. You don't have to do this for anyone but yourself, Michael. But if you're afraid of failing, don't be. Michael swallowed. What if I'm not as good as they think? His mother squeezed his hand. Then show them who you really are. The words lingered in the quiet air. Michael looked back at his notebook. And for the first time, he picked up his pencil, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Tomorrow, he would step into the unknown. And he had no idea what he would find there. The morning air was crisp, the sky above Los Angeles a cloudless stretch of pale blue. The towering campus of Crestwood Academy, the host school for the district math competition, loomed ahead like a fortress of prestige and expectation. Michael stepped off the bus, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. His heart pounded with an unfamiliar intensity, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of what this moment meant. He had spent his whole life avoiding situations like this. Situations where eyes followed his every move, where failure wasn't just possible, it was public. Now he was walking straight into one. The courtyard buzzed with students from different schools, all dressed in their best competition attire, clutching notebooks, speaking in hushed, determined voices. Some glanced at him, their expressions unreadable. They know. They had heard about the boy who had dismantled an impossible equation in Devlin's class. The unknown genius. Michael felt the stares like static electricity against his skin. You look like you're about to throw up. He turned to find Emily, hands in her coat pockets, amusement flickering behind her sharp brown eyes. Michael exhaled. Not helping. She smirked. Just keeping it real. I don't care about this strategy working out for you. Michael shot her a look, but before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. All right, competitors inside. The competition hall was vast, lined with rows of desks, each one meticulously arranged with name cards and blank answer sheets. A digital countdown clock loomed over the room, ticking down the minutes before the first round. Michael's chair felt too stiff, too foreign beneath him as he sat down and ran a hand over his face. Then Devlin appeared. The teacher's presence was as imposing as ever, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the hall. But when his gaze landed on Michael, there was no smugness, no condescension, only expectation. Michael braced himself for some last-minute remark, some subtle dig, but instead, Devlin simply nodded and walked away. Michael frowned. That felt different. The countdown reached 0. The first question appeared on the projector screen. Michael's fingers tightened around his pencil. No turning back now. Round 1, precision. The questions were brutal, designed to weed out the unprepared. Each one a tangled mass of numbers, proofs, and sequences meant to test not just intelligence, but composure under pressure. Michael worked methodically, breaking down problems with sharp efficiency. He tuned out everything: the ticking clock, the rustling of papers, the occasional sharp breath from a struggling competitor. For the first time in days, his mind felt quiet. This was his world. He wasn't Michael Brooks, the reluctant participant. He wasn't the invisible kid in the back of the classroom. He was solving, and for the first time, he allowed himself to enjoy it. The first break. Michael stepped into the hallway, the rush of conversation hitting him like a wave. Some competitors were discussing answers, some were anxiously flipping through notes. Emily found him almost immediately. "You looked terrifying in there," she said, falling into step beside him. "Like some kind of math assassin." Michael huffed a quiet laugh. "I just zoned in." She studied him. "And how did it feel?" Michael considered that. "Not as bad as I thought." She grinned. "Knew it." Before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "You're Michael Brooks." Michael turned to find a tall, sharp-eyed competitor from another school standing behind him, arms crossed. His name tag read, Daniel Price, Crestwood Academy. Michael tensed. "Yeah." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "You're good." Michael blinked. That wasn't what he had expected. Daniel tilted his head. "But let's see if you can keep up when it really matters." And with that, he walked away. Michael exhaled slowly. Emily smirked. "Friendly guy." Michael only shook his head. The real competition hadn't even started yet. The competition hall felt different now. Tighter. Heavier. The air hummed with a tension that hadn't been there before. Michael sat at his desk, his fingers gripping his pencil, eyes locked on the next problem projected onto the massive screen at the front of the room. Round 2. Theoretical application. This wasn't just about solving equations anymore. It was about understanding the core of mathematical logic, bending numbers into something beyond simple calculations. Here, intuition mattered as much as skill. The problem in front of him was a maze of abstract thought, a puzzle with no obvious solution. Around him, competitors hesitated. Pens hovered, brows furrowed. Even Daniel Price, the smug Crestwood Academy prodigy, had his lips pressed into a thin line as he scribbled notes on the side of his page. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears. This was different. This was hard. A sliver of doubt slid into his mind. What if I can't do this? His hands, steady until now, trembled slightly. He stared at the problem. Stared at it too long. And for the first time since stepping into this competition, his mind went blank. The clock. The pressure. The silence. Minutes bled away. Michael's fingers remained frozen over the page. His breathing turned shallow, uneven. The fear he had buried, the one he thought he had conquered, came roaring back. What if they were right? What if this wasn't who he was? What if Devlin had been wrong about him? What if? A hand slammed against his desk. Michael flinched. Emily stood beside him, one hand gripping the edge of his table, the other casually holding a half-empty water bottle. She wasn't supposed to be here, but she didn't care. She leaned in, voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Brooks." Michael swallowed, his throat dry. Emily's eyes were steady, grounding. "You already know the answer," she murmured. "Stop thinking so much." Michael's pulse pounded. He wanted to snap that it wasn't that simple, that she didn't understand. But something about the certainty in her voice cut through the storm in his head. "Stop thinking." Michael inhaled sharply. He looked at the problem again. Not as a student, not as a competitor, but as Michael Brooks, the kid who loved numbers long before anyone cared. And suddenly, he saw it. A thread, a pattern, a path through the chaos. His hand moved. Scribbling, solving, building. Numbers and symbols fell into place, forming a perfect equation, a complete answer. The clock ticked. Michael dropped his pencil, staring at the solution in front of him. He had done it. Emily smirked. "Took you long enough." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away like she had never been there. Michael exhaled. And for the first time in the competition, he wasn't afraid anymore. Final break, the showdown approaches. The hallway buzzed with competitors murmuring about the brutal second round. Some looked relieved, others defeated. Michael leaned against the wall, his head tilted back, trying to shake the adrenaline still pumping through his system. "You pulled that out of nowhere," a voice said. Michael turned. Daniel Price. His arms were crossed, but his expression held something different now, curiosity. Michael shrugged. "Figured it out." Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. Then he smirked. "Final round's next. Let's see if you're the real deal." Michael's fingers curled into a fist. For the first time, he wasn't dreading it. For the first time, he wanted to win. One round left. One final test. And this time, he was ready. The competition hall was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that stretched tight over the room, pressing down on the competitors, filling every inch of space with an invisible weight. Michael sat at his desk, fingers lightly gripping his pencil, his pulse steady now, not with fear, but with focus. Final round, the ultimate proof. The projector flickered, and a single problem appeared on the screen. It was unlike anything they had faced before. Not a simple equation. Not a structured theorem. Proof. A problem without an obvious path, requiring not just logic but creativity, intuition, and absolute understanding of mathematical principles. A murmur rippled through the room. Some competitors stiffened. Others stared at their blank pages frozen. At the judge's signal, the timer began counting down. Michael exhaled. And then he moved. The rhythm of the numbers. His mind worked in layers, peeling back complexity, searching for the underlying truth beneath the surface. He didn't hesitate now. He built the foundation. Defined the key variables. Isolated the contradictions. Others hesitated, scribbled, erased, started over. Michael's pencil never stopped. He wasn't solving the problem. He was unraveling it, piece by piece, step by step, as if the answer had always been there, waiting for him to find it. And then he saw it. The final connection. The missing link. Michael pressed his pencil down, writing the last perfect stroke. He circled his answer, and then slowly leaned back in his chair. He was the first one finished. The moment of truth. One by one, the judges collected the answer sheets. Some students still scrambled, erasing furiously, rewriting in frantic desperation. Michael sat still, his heartbeat slow, controlled. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just hoping to blend in. He wanted them to see him. Minutes passed. The judges reviewed, murmured among themselves. Then the head judge stood. The winner of the district mathematics competition is... Breathless pause. Michael Brooks, Westbridge Academy. The world seemed to stop. Then the room erupted. A mixture of stunned gasps, whispers, scattered applause. Michael exhaled, his chest rising, falling. Not because he was relieved. Because he had known. For the first time, he had believed in himself before anyone else did. After the competition, Michael stepped outside, the cold air hitting his skin like a reset button. A familiar voice cut through the moment. "So, math genius, how does it feel?" "Emily." Michael smirked. "Weird." She grinned. "Yeah, well, get used to it." Then Devlin appeared. Michael turned to face him, waiting for something. Criticism. Some half-hearted attempt at taking credit. A challenge for what came next. But Devlin only nodded. Not as a teacher. As someone who had seen something in Michael before he had seen it in himself. "You did well," Devlin said simply. Michael met his gaze. For once, there was no tension between them. And for the first time, Michael understood Devlin had never been his enemy. He had been his test. Michael turned back toward the school. The whispers, the rumors, the expectations, they would never stop. But now they didn't scare him. Because he wasn't hiding anymore. And he never would again.